see Oslo remote. All right, and it is 6:40, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I am Mickey Gousset. I'm a DevOps architect on the Microsoft DevOps Customer Advisory team, and I'm here in the next hour to talk to you about building a DevOps culture and about our journey, and specifically the Azure DevOps engineering team's journey to adopting both an Agile mindset and building out a DevOps culture that has kind of flowed throughout all of Microsoft. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the DevOps Customer Advisory team, and part of my job is to go out and help people get more DevOpsy, whatever that might mean. But I have to ask you something very important first. Do you know what Tupelo, Mississippi is world famous for? So I am from Tupelo, Mississippi. It is a small 30,000 person town in northeast Mississippi, and it gets about 10,000 people a year that come to my town to visit, probably half of which come from Europe, actually. So normally I'd poll the audience, but what I'll do instead is just tell you we are famous because we are the birthplace of Elvis Presley. That's right. Elvis Presley was born in a two-room, not a two-bedroom, but a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi. So people come to Tupelo, they tour his house, they tour the church, they go to the hardware store downtown where he bought his first guitar at age 9, which is still a hardware store, still owned by the same people that sold him that guitar. And then they go up to Memphis, Tennessee to see Graceland, which is where he lived when he got famous. So that's my small town's claim to fame. But let's face it, you're not here to listen to me talk about Tupelo, Mississippi. You're here to listen to me talk about DevOps and our DevOps journey here at Microsoft. And to do that, we first have to start off by defining what we mean by DevOps. And if you've been to any Microsoft presentation on DevOps in the past couple of years, then you've seen this definition. So Donovan Brown came up with our definition, which is DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable the continuous delivery of value to our end users. And there is a lot of goodness in that statement. People, process, and products. Those are the three things. Out of those three things, products, least important, which may sound strange coming from somebody whose company sells a product that's called Azure DevOps. But products is the least important. There are so many products out there that you can use to help you drive your DevOps journey. What's important is people and process. And what's most important is the people, is the culture. You've got to have the right culture in place. You've got to have the right mindset in place in order to succeed on your DevOps journey. So as I mentioned, I am part of the DevOps Customer Advisory team, which is part of the Azure DevOps engineering team. And Azure DevOps is Microsoft's tool for doing, used to be called Team Foundation Server, and it's their tool to help you enable your development processes. So it has work item tracking, it has version control, it has pipelines for doing CI and CD types of things. But one of the things that we really wanted to happen with the Azure DevOps platform is we wanted to work with any other language and any other platform. So we tried to be as open and extensible as we could, so we integrate with a lot of different things. You want to use Jira to track your work items, but you want to use Azure Pipelines to deploy? Go ahead. You want to use Azure Boards to track your work items, but you want to use Jenkins or Chef or Puppet to help with deployments? Go ahead. We've tried to be as open as we can to work with, to meet you in the middle where you can use the tools that you want to use to get your work done. Now, we weren't always like this. So I want to take you back in time just a little bit. So what we've got here is a comic that came out several years ago that outlines the different organizational charts for some of the major companies at the time. And this was Microsoft's organizational chart. And it's pretty realistic in actuality because we had different organizations, like we had the Windows team and we had the Office team, and every team built software the way they wanted to build it. They used the tools they wanted to use, they used the processes they wanted to use, they did things the way they wanted to, and nobody was necessarily doing things in a consistent manner, which led to a lot of things that weren't great. It was very hard to move engineers from one team to another because they had to learn brand new tools, brand new processes, brand new everything almost. So Satya Nadella became our CEO back in the middle of the decade, and he brought a couple of great things to Microsoft. And one of those things we're going to mention a lot today, which is this idea of a growth mindset. The idea that it is okay to fail as long as you learn from your failures. One of the other things he brought, though, was the idea of the one engineering system, or one ES. He saw that we had all these different systems that all these different people were using, and he saw the inefficiencies that that was causing. So he made the decision that, hey, let's get us all working on the same tools with some similar processes, not necessarily completely the same processes, but similar processes, and that's going to make everybody more productive. So he brought that in and implemented that concept for us. And that's a concept that's still ongoing. We have a one ES team inside of Microsoft whose goal is to help the internal teams inside of Microsoft move to Azure DevOps and move on to and help them with their processes. It's a slow process. We've gotten the Windows team moved on. We actually broke Git when we put the Windows code base into Git because it was so large. We're onboarding the Office team, and then we have other teams that we've been onboarding as well. So it is definitely a journey. It's going to take us, years to actually ultimately achieve that. So let's look though at the roadmap so far for the Azure DevOps group and Microsoft as well. So along the top line, we have the roadmap so far for the Azure DevOps group. Along the bottom line, we have some things that we've done from an open source perspective in the community. So Team Foundation Server started as a boxed product in 2005 that you could just go buy. In 2010, we decided, hey, we probably need to start, this cloud thing obviously isn't going away. We probably need to offer some kind of software as a service for Team Foundation Server. So in August 2010, we started that development, and we decided we were going to do 3-week sprints, and it took us about 2 years to get to a preview. And you can actually go out and see every 3 weeks we've released something in the sprints, and you can go out to the Azure DevOps blog and you can actually see what we've released every sprint, even including what we released just I think last week or the week before. So it took us to about 2012 to get to that preview stage. Then it took in 2013 I think we actually released. In 2014 is when we started our little 1ES journey. 2017, we brought Windows onto Git. 2018 is when we released our upgraded Azure Pipelines aspects. And, every 3 weeks for the past 10 years, we have been constantly iterating, constantly adding things to the Azure DevOps product. So on the bottom line, though, we've also been getting more and more involved in the open source community, which if you have been around Microsoft for a long time, you realize that that wasn't always the case. But in March 2010, we had 400 open source projects. Now I think Microsoft is one of the largest contributors to open source projects on GitHub. We've released multiple things as far as like VS Code, which is completely open sourced and out there. And as most of you probably know, in 2018, we acquired GitHub. And, GitHub is one of the leading platforms for development. So the 5 habits, though, that we've kind of determined so far in our DevOps journey are what I want to talk about today. And these are the 5 habits, which are being customer obsessed, production first mindset, team autonomy and enterprise alignment, which is my favorite out of all of these to talk about, shifting left in quality, and how you can do safe deployments and limit damage that might happen from a bad deployment. So we're going to talk through all of these things today. Now, I'm going to go ahead and warn you, normally this is like a 3-hour talk, but don't worry, I've pared it down, so we should get through it in plenty of time. But we're going to start off by talking about being customer obsessed. We are running a service and also delivering an on-prem version of Azure DevOps Server. The on-prem version hasn't gone away. It's just called Azure DevOps Server now, not Azure DevOps, not Team Foundation Server. But we want to listen to our customers, and especially we want to provide different ways for our customers to provide us feedback. We're providing a product to them, and we want to integrate their feedback back into the loop as quickly as we can. So we try to listen to our customers both quantitatively, getting a lot of feedback, and qualitatively, making sure that feedback is triaged and is good feedback that we can actually be actionable against. So you have multiple ways to provide us feedback. You could go to developer community. If you go to developer community and you ask a question, that automatically gets put into our backlog in Azure DevOps, where it will get triaged. And I've seen the monthly emails that go out that list the top 10 things that have been voted up through developer community. And those things get triaged into our work and ultimately has led to new functionality or changes to existing functionality in the Azure DevOps product. We monitor a bunch of social media. So if you go ask questions on Stack Overflow and you tag it Azure DevOps, we've got engineers out there that try to answer those. There's a subreddit out there called Azure DevOps. I try to monitor that subreddit and try to answer questions there when I can. So we try to go to where the community is to answer questions, which is good feedback for you, because for your customers, you should be going to where the customer is to try to answer the customer's questions. On the actual Azure DevOps site, we have the ability for you to provide us feedback. So you can make a suggestion or raise an issue, and it automatically will go into the backlog. And if you've been using the product, one of the things you'll see is every once in a while, we're going to ask you, hey, what do you think of the product? And you're going to rate it for us. And this rating is what we use to calculate our net promoter score, which is a way of determining how well people like your website. And finally, for our top 100 customers, we have what's called a champion for that customer. So this is a member of the product team that actually goes out and talks to that customer once a week, once a month, whatever the customer wants, to understand how they're using Azure DevOps, gather feedback, and roll that feedback into the planning process. These are our top 100 customers that use Azure DevOps extensively, so they have a lot of good feedback into how the product is working or not working for them. So we try to listen to our customers in a lot of different ways. Being customer obsessed also means that there are certain things that we want to measure and certain things that we don't necessarily care as much about. Now, a lot of times what we want to measure also depends on who we are. So for example, if I'm a developer on the feature team, what I want to measure may be a little bit different than if I'm mid-level management than if I'm senior leadership team. But what we found is a lot of the things we care about, since we're running a 24/7 site, are things like acquisition. How many people come to the site and actually sign up? Retention. How many people come back and use the site at least twice a week? NPS score. So how satisfied are they with the site? How fast are we able to build the site and get the site deployed? As you're going to see, we actually build and deploy Azure DevOps using Azure DevOps, which is kind of cool. And then of course, we're running a live site now. We have to keep this thing up and running. So we care about, how fast can we detect issues? Did we detect the issue before somebody else told us that we did? How fast did we resolve it? All of these are things that holistically everybody on all the different feature teams inside of the Azure DevOps organization cares about. Some things we don't watch as much, and this isn't necessarily true team by team, but some of the things we don't necessarily care about as much are we don't necessarily track team burn down. We don't necessarily track code coverage. We actually do track number of bugs found, but we do that at a feature team level. So the reason we kind of have this listed as things we don't watch is that at the leadership level, that's not stuff they care about. They care about all the stuff that's in green. At the feature team level, yes, there are some of these things in red that the feature teams do care about. but you need to ultimately just measure what you want to track. One of the things we found is when we first started with this service is we turned on all kind of monitoring that we could. And the problem we encountered is we gathered so much data we didn't know what to do with it, which is why we kind of stepped back and were very precise in what we wanted to try to measure. So when we build out new features, we have about 45 feature teams on the Azure DevOps engineering team. And when we build out new features, we kind of follow this whole build, measure, learn way of doing things. So we make a guess, we make a hypothesis that we believe that you want this feature because of this reason. Then we go out, build it, deploy it, and start monitoring it and start determining, are people using the feature? How are they using the feature? Are they using the feature the same way that we expected them to use the feature? So it's not just about building it or guessing what they want, building it, and then deploying it and ignoring it. We've got to gather the feedback and learn how people are using what we've deployed out there. And honestly, we don't always get it right. And this is where Satya has come in with growth mindset and shown us that it's okay to fail as long as you learn from it. So again, we don't always get it right. For example, in 2013, we released something called Team Rooms inside of Team Foundation Server. This was basically our way of competing with Slack. It was built into the product, and we thought this is what developers wanted, and we thought they were just going to flock to it. And ultimately what we found is nobody used it, so a few years later, we took it out of the product. We admitted to the fact that, hey, this isn't working, and rather than continue to throw resources at it to try to make it work, let's just take it out, readjust those resources, and move on. And that goes back to the fact that we had implemented this monitoring and learning aspect because we want to be customer obsessed and provide our customers exactly what they want. So first habit, customer obsessed. Second habit is we need to have a production first mindset. We are running a 24/7 service used by millions of people. We need to make sure that that is always up and running. But here's the problem. We've never done it. We started building this product back in 2010, and before that, all the experience on this team was building boxed software that we shipped. So now we have a service that we're going to constantly update every 3 weeks, and we need to make sure it stays up all the time. So we had to figure out, how do we do this? The first step was we have 41 feature teams building out new features. How do we know when a feature is done? We had to come up with what we considered our definition of done. So we consider a feature to be done, or an update to a feature to be done, when it is live in production, so it's been deployed, collecting telemetry, so we have monitoring on it that's coming back and that we are reviewing and looking at, that either supports or diminishes the starting hypothesis. So the monitoring, the telemetry that comes back is either saying you built the right thing or you didn't build the right thing. It is important, really, no matter what type of software you're building, that you have some sort of definition of done. So that is something to keep in mind. But this was our definition of done, so of how we were going to handle the fact that since we're constantly evolving this service, how do we know when something is done? We also had to figure out how to handle live site incidents, or LSIs, because we're running a live site and it's going to have problems. So we've evolved this over time, but the way it works right now is when we detect an issue, either through our monitoring or through somebody alerting us that there was an issue, then we immediately spin up an LSI bridge, and then the DRIs are brought on. Welcome to Microsoft, home of more acronyms than you can imagine. We actually have an internal tool where you can search for acronyms to understand what those acronyms are. The DRIs are what's called the designated responsible individual. Every feature team is responsible for their feature in production. So every week, somebody from each feature team is on call. They are considered the DRI. So if you have 12 people on your feature team, then once a quarter for a week, you are on call. And on call means if there's a problem and an LSI conference bridge is spun up, you have 5 minutes to get on that call during the week and 15 minutes to get on it during nights and weekends. And it's actually Satya Nadella, a recording of him calling you saying, hey, there's a problem, would you mind getting on the call? So when we have a live site incident, we spin up this bridge, the DRIs are brought on the call, and they start trying to, honestly, solve the problem. They'll bring in other people if they need to. We'll reach out to the Azure team or other teams if we need to help us with doing things. We'll rotate people in and out of those calls as we need to especially if it's a long running call. And we need to track everything related to our live site incidents so that we can hopefully make it where they don't happen again. And what you see on the right side of the screen is our incident management system. This is not our help desk system. This is our ICM, our incident management system that we built internally just for managing live site incidents. And in that system, we capture things like time to detect, time to mitigate. We capture how we determined there was an issue, how we troubleshot the issue, how we resolved it. At the bottom, you can see there are repair items, which are work items for things we need to go do to make sure this doesn't happen again. So it's very important if you're going to have a production first mindset that when you have issues, you track everything around that issue so that you're able to know what caused it and how you fixed it so that you hopefully can put some monitoring and such in place to where it doesn't happen again. One of the rules we have is that if someone alerts us to a live site incident before one of our automatic monitors does, then we need to, in the next 6 weeks, in the next 2 sprints, we need to put something in place so that we can automatically detect whatever that is. So we're trying to constantly improve our monitoring as we go forward. Live site is top priority. This is actually one of our NOCs that we have for our site reliability engineers to help us with the live sites. We do weekly live site reviews. So they have a weekly review, and anyone who is involved in a live site incident goes to this review to provide the information about that review. If we've had to make a quick fix or push something into production to solve a problem to get things working, we then have 6 weeks, 2 sprints, to be able to push that back through our full formal process so that we can make sure it goes through all of our formal process and gets redeployed again. This is super important. The whole DRI thing, the whole feature team being responsible for the code in production was a game changer for us. And that's actually, when I talk to customers, seems to be a game changer for them as well. We also found it was important to provide an accurate service status page. So if you go to status.dev.azure.com, you can see the status of Azure DevOps. That way, customers can go and see where things stand without necessarily just pinging out on Twitter or trying to say, hey, is the service up or not? We also, as part of production first and also being customer obsessed, we're transparent about the problems. And this is something a lot of customers I talk to, their IT organizations necessarily aren't that transparent when there's issues. And what you're going to find is if you fess up, if you tell people what happened and why it happened and what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again, they're going to respect you more, and it's actually going to make a better bond between you and the customer. A couple of examples. We have, look at that graph on the left because it's going to come back. But we had an event, the Visual Studio online launch event in 2013 when this product launched. We had some major issues there, which I'll explain what happened a little bit later. But we were very upfront and honest about this is what happened. Brian Harry wrote a several page blog post on what happened, what we're doing to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. Back in August, September of 2018, lightning struck a data center, Azure data center in Texas, and basically brought Azure DevOps down for almost 2 days. We were upfront about what happened there and why that occurred and what we've put in place now to make sure that doesn't happen again. It's fun note, at the top there, that little green Visual Studio Team Services is up and running. That was our status page at the time. And even though Azure DevOps, it was called Visual Studio Team Services then, was down, the status page kept saying it was up because we couldn't get to the servers in that data center to change the status page, which is why having a good status page is important. But being transparent with your customers, being open with your customers, being empathetic with your customers, it's going to serve you well long-term because it's going to make a better bond between you and those customers. Now, we've built out this service that we're deploying every 3 weeks, and initially deployments were manual, and then they were partially automated, but there were still some manual every time we moved to a new environment, there were still some manual things that we needed to do. And one of our tenets that have come out of this is there's no such thing as partial automation, because what we had an issue with one time is we had a bunch of these deployment commands that we had to run that were in OneNote, a bunch of PowerShell. So we would cut and paste from OneNote into the PowerShell command line window. So we had commands like this. And if you've ever cut and paste from Word or OneNote into a command line window, then you know that those aren't real quotes. You have to backspace over them and replace them. So imagine having a dozen steps like that where you have to backspace over them and replace them, and then you miss one and you break pre-production for half a day or a day because you missed one of these manual steps. I can't tell you how many customers I go and talk to who feel like they have a really solid CI/CD pipeline in place, but they're deploying, as they deploy to each environment, they then remote into the server to make manual configuration changes. That's partial automation, and partial automation is bad. And we, after one too many times of having issues, we learned that and decided that we were going to fix that. So now we automate everything completely. We still have a big chunk of PowerShell scripts that are used for helping do the deployments, but we've got those in version control and we've got those running as part of Azure pipelines. And we deploy to every environment the same way. So whether we're deploying to Canary, to Dev, to Test, to QA, to Prod, we're deploying to the same environment the same way every time using the same tools, which in this case is Azure pipelines. Security has also become very important, and I'm sure everyone on this call will probably agree that security is something that we need to keep in the forefront of our mind. So with this in mind, we started off by saying, hey, let's have a red team and a blue team. So the red team will be constantly trying to break in, and the blue team will be constantly trying to catch the red team. Initially, we would do things like, for the next 3 days, we're going to do a war games. Red team try to break in, blue team try to catch them. Over time, we got rid of the blue team because we decided that everyone in the Azure DevOps organization needs to be part of the blue team. They need to be constantly aware of phishing attacks, constantly aware of something doesn't look right. I need to tell somebody something. And I've gotten phishing attack emails from the red team during my time here at Microsoft that then we've turned into the appropriate people. But security needs to be something that we're constantly doing and handling. Another area where we're trying to be more secure is shifting left with security, trying to implement security earlier in the development cycle, not just worrying about security once it's live and out in production, but trying to do things earlier in the system. Trying to make sure that we don't check code into version control that has connection strings with user IDs and passwords in it, or personal access tokens to Azure or AWS. Trying to make sure that we're not using vulnerable OSS packages. These are all things that we've done to try to make sure that before that code even gets merged into the master branch, it has been scanned and we've removed a lot of these vulnerabilities. And GitHub has some great options for this too. If you've not seen their dependency management and some of the other things there, really cool. See Dependabot just opening up a pull request telling you, hey, this open source package you're using is out of date, go check it out. But we try to shift our security earlier in the development cycle to solve the problems before they're even getting deployed. All right, doing good so far. Now we're at my favorite part of this talk, which is the team autonomy and enterprise alignment part. So we've talked customer obsession, we've talked production first mindset. Now we're going to talk team autonomy and enterprise alignment. But first, I want to tell you a story. So we have two groups, and this is a true story. We have two groups. We have Group A, who's making a product. Now, Group A is a business that's been around for a while. They're well established. People know who they are. They've got money. They hire the best people, and they're wanting to make this product. And we have Group B. Group B is making a similar competing product, but the difference is it's not a company. It's just a group of people that are doing it in their spare time because they want to work on what they're doing. They believe in what they're doing. So this is a true story. Normally when you say, hey, which group would succeed, most people think Group A because they've got the money, they can hire the best people. This is their day job. This is what they're supposed to work on. But if we actually look at the players in this story, we've got Group A, which is Microsoft and Carta, and we have Group B, which is Wikipedia. And if you want to know what Microsoft and Carta is, you can read about it on Wikipedia. Group B won. Microsoft and Carta was a digital multimedia encyclopedia. So we have these two different groups building the same thing, and ultimately Group B won because they felt like they had autonomy, mastery, and purpose. They felt like they had a little bit of control of their destiny. So at Microsoft, we're always finding books to read, and one of the books we found was by Daniel Pink called Drive. And Drive came out, I think, 2010 or so. Still a great book, still should read it. It talks about what motivates teams and what motivates people. And initially what motivated people is food and shelter. Then it was money. But research now shows what really motivates people, especially teams of people, is when they have three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And they feel like they have some control over their destiny. So the Agile DevOps team decided, okay, how do we we have 41 feature teams. How do we give them some autonomy, but still ensure that we can, track everything and make sure that we've got everything getting built that needs to get built? And we decided to go with what we called aligned autonomy. So we made a list of all the different things that we might want to care about. And we decided that the top 5 were going to be things that every feature team will be aligned on. We're going to have the same roles. So we're going to call them engineers, or we're going to call them program managers. We're going to have the same cadence. So every feature team is going to deliver on a 3-week cadence. We're going to have the same taxonomy. So we're going to call work items the same thing. But when it gets to the actual individual feature teams, we're going to give them some autonomy on how they do things. So some teams may do hardcore Scrum. Some teams may do Scrum Light. Some teams may just use a Kanban board. We're gonna let them how they want to plan things and the different practices they want to use inside that feature team. Every team's allowed to be different, but we're all going to be aligned on these core items that affect all the different teams. And by providing them that autonomy, the members of the feature teams feel like they have some skin in the game. They feel like they are involved. They feel like they have the ability to make decisions that affect themselves. And that makes them more productive. A quick talk on roles that we have at Microsoft. Used to be we had program managers, dev, and testers. And developers did no testing. They threw it over the wall to the testers. So there was a great culling at one point where we basically said that's not going to work, and we still kept program management, but then we created engineering, which is basically developers who also test. So we have program management and we have engineering now as our two main roles. Program management, think of them as kind of like the business analysts. They're still very technical, but they're determining what we're building and why we're building it. They're talking to the customers. Engineering is concerned with how we're going to build it and making sure that we're building things that are quality. Now, when we form teams, the feature teams that we form, usually we have one or two program managers and the rest engineering. And in that, each feature team is made up of some program managers and some engineers. We have bought into the team room concept, and an idea of a team room is you have a large open room that everybody sits in to do their work. One of the things at Microsoft that it used to be is you always got an office with a door. You might have to share it with someone, but you always got an office with a door. Now we've moved to the idea of these physical team rooms. Some people love them, some people hate them. But overall, we found that it does help us increase our communication. Our teams are usually about 10 to 12 people, and they're self-managing. They form without necessarily managers being told you're on this team, you're on this team. And I'll show you how we do that in just a moment. The feature teams themselves have a clear charter and goals of what they're trying to accomplish. And they own the features in production, and they own when those features are deployed. So each feature team can determine when the feature is deployed, and they can also determine, but then they're also responsible for making sure that once that feature is in production, if there's an issue with it, they have to solve the problem with that feature. So the sticky note exercise, is how we actually form our teams. So every 12 to 18 months, we go into the conference room and we put all the different feature teams up on the boards, and you're given 3 sticky notes, and you put your first and your second and your third choice. This is an opportunity for you to be able to change teams without doing any kind of formal interview or any kind of top-down reorg. It's driven by the employees, not the managers. Haven't seen this done anywhere else. It's only been done, as far as I've seen, at Microsoft. And usually less than about 20% of the people want to change teams, because they're building out these teams because they're on this team because they like what they're doing. But everybody gets the choice to change teams if they want to. And by allowing people to move to different teams, we're able to cross-pollinate the teams and make sure that if somebody wins the lottery and decides to quit, we don't lose a lot of domain knowledge when they decide to quit. From a planning perspective, we've got a book that has started to influence our planning. It's called Measure What Matter. It's about OKRs. And we've changed our planning to where we now have a 12-month strategy, 2 6-month semesters, 4 quarters, and then we have sprints. So a sprint is 3 weeks, a quarter is 4 sprints or 12 weeks, and then a semester is 6 months or 2 quarters, and then we have the strategy. So we lay out the strategy for the whole year and in broad strokes for each semester. Leadership is responsible for that. Then the teams, goes back to that whole aligned autonomy, we're aligned at the 12-month strategy level, but the teams are responsible for building out the detail of what they're going to build to hit that big picture over these time frames and when it's going to deploy. Measure What Matters. It's a book on OKRs, which is called Objectives and Key Results. So this is all the rage right now for how people are doing planning. And the idea is you're going to define an objective which is something you want to accomplish, and then you're going to define a key result, which is how you measure whether you accomplished that objective. And we're very open with these. They're posted out where anyone can see them. And the reason this has been helpful is because if a team needs to understand what they need to work on, or if what they're doing is the right direction, they can go look at the defined objectives and key results for that quarter to know if they're helping push those objectives and key results forward. For example, this is an example of one of the objectives and key results from Azure Pipelines. Grow a strong and happy customer base. Objectives are supposed to be nebulous. They're not measurable. But then you'll notice that the key results are specific things that we can measure. So you define a nebulous objective and then the specific key results to help you know if you've hit that objective. The other thing that's encouraged if you follow this mindset, and I highly recommend you read this book, is your key results should be ambitious. You really should only hit about 70% of your key results. If you hit more than 70% of your key results, then you probably didn't push yourself as hard as you could have. Now, we have 41 feature teams, each releasing every 3 weeks. We had to figure out a way of how do we stay in sync. So how do we, we could do retrospectives at the end of every sprint, and then we'd spend the entire next sprint almost doing retrospectives. So Microsoft is an email-heavy customer, or email-heavy company, so we decided to go with what we call the sprint mail. So at the end of every sprint, we send out sprint mails that show what the different feature teams did for that sprint. And then at the end of every 2 sprints, we check in on our OKRs to see, hey, are we going to hit them? Has anything changed? And then at the end of every 4 sprints, which is every quarter, we do an OKR reset. So every quarter, we review our OKRs and change those depending on, whatever's changed in the world that makes us want to change what our objectives were. Our sprint mails initially started out as every feature team sent out a sprint mail. And it was basically, this is what we did this sprint, this is what we're going to do next sprint, and maybe has some demos in it for people to see. What we found is we were sending out 41 of these emails and people weren't necessarily reading them because there were so many emails getting sent. They were just getting put into a folder. So we changed this a little bit when we went with OKRs to where now we kind of roll this up into our objectives and our epics, so that maybe instead of all 5 feature teams on the Azure board team sending out an email, just the Azure board principal program manager sends out an email that covers everything that all 5 teams did. But instead of just saying, this is what we did, this is what we're doing next month, we also tie it back to the objectives and the key results that we've defined. So we're able to see how the work we've done helps push those OKRs forward. All right, stick with me. We got 2 left. We got 15 minutes. We're doing great. So we've talked customer obsession, production first mindset, team autonomy and enterprise alignment. Next up, shifting left on quality. How do we ensure quality earlier in the development cycle? We talked about that a little bit with security already. So how do we go fast and not break things? Well, the first thing that we decided is if we're going to go fast and not break things, we've got to do it by not incurring debt, and specifically bug debt. So one of the first things we implemented is what we call our bug cap. So we take the number of engineers on your team, let's call it 10, and multiply that by a number. We've played with this number a lot. Right now it's 4. And that is your bug cap number. So for a team with 10 engineers, the bug cap is 40. What the bug cap means is if at the end of a sprint, you're over your bug cap, you have 40 or more bugs, the next sprint, all you're doing is fixing bugs. You're not getting to build new software, you're not getting to add new features. All you're doing the next sprint is fixing bugs. This one thing right here, when we implemented it, made our quality go through the roof. Because developers don't like fixing bugs. Developers like writing new software, writing new code. So when we put this in place, it made them go, oh, I don't want to have to fix bugs. I want to write new code. I've seen companies take this and put this in place and see their quality increase. This is probably one of the easiest things you could do to get yourself started on getting better at DevOps. We also changed how we do our branching. So we moved to Git from TFVC, and we've moved to kind of this release flow trunk-based development type of branching, where essentially we have our main line and we have feature branches off of those main line. In this case, they're calling them topic branches. Now, the key with our feature branches is we try to keep them short-lived. However, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 weeks to build a feature. So what we do is we're constantly pulling and pushing from master. So we're constantly merging back into the main line, and then we're constantly pulling from the main line. And we do this using feature flags. So we're able to hide the code that's not ready yet with feature flags. Now, when we get ready to release, we do create a release branch, and we release off of that release branch. If we find a problem during the release, we fix it on master, and then cherry pick it down into the release. And the reason we fix it on master is so that any feature branches out there, the next time they do a pull, it will actually, they'll get that hot fix. But remember, our branches, we try to keep them short-lived. They're not always short-lived, but if they're not, we're constantly pulling and pushing from the main line using feature flags to hide the code that's not ready. In fact, out in Azure DevOps right now, there is code out there right now hidden by feature flags that you're not aware of. We also started making use of pull requests as a way to ensure quality. So our pull requests, before you can merge from a branch back to the main line, we have multiple things that have to happen. We have a whole bunch of unit tests that have to run. There's some manual approvals that have to happen. We're using this to ensure that the quality of code that makes it back to the main line is much, much better, which ensures the release will go better. In fact, you can see on the right-hand side all the different branch policies that are required to pass before we could do a merge from this branch back to the main line. All of these different builds have to pass. We have a whole bunch of tests that have to pass. In this case, we're only running a subset of them. We're running about 28,000 unit tests that run in about 3 minutes or less. But we could run our full suite of unit tests, which I think takes 25 minutes to run, and ensure that we haven't done anything to break things before it gets back into master. We also decided green means green and red means red. So if we're going to have all these different test runs that we want to run over here on the left-hand side on a particular build, then everything needs to pass before we move this on. It used to be we would look at it and we would go, oh, that test failed. It's okay that test failed because it doesn't really matter. So move on into production anyway. We no longer do that. If we have a test, either it has to pass, or we don't deploy, or we need to remove that test. There's no reason to have tests out there that are flaky tests that sometimes work, sometimes don't, and therefore you just skip them when you feel like it. We changed how we do our testing. We had a lot of these end-to-end scenario tests that took forever to run. And a lot of times we couldn't even run those until we got into production or close to production. So we decided to change our tactic on testing and go with more unit testing. So we have a lot more what we call L0 and L1 tests, which are unit tests. And then we have some L2 tests and some L3 tests, which are functional tests or tests that we run in production. But we bought all in on moving over to unit testing. And we started this process. We had 26,000, 28,000 of these long-running scenario tests and very few unit tests. And so what we decided to do was, as we wrote new code, that new code had to have a unit test. And as we touched existing code, if that code didn't have a unit test, we had to create a unit test for it. And we started this journey to move more toward unit testing. And when I tell this story to customers, they get all excited and they turn to you in IT and they say, hey, go do this, make it happen in a month. It took us 2.5 years. You can see at some point there was an inflection point where we had the same amount of unit tests as we had these scenario tests. And then now we've gotten up to, even that number is not right. I think it's closer to 90,000 unit tests that we have. And the key with our unit tests is they have to run fast. We can run our entire suite of unit tests, I think, in less than 30 minutes. But we're ensuring, again, that quality. We've now gone all the way to the pull request level of a feature branch and are ensuring quality there before it even gets to main and can then get deployed. Okay, last thing, safe deployments and limiting damage. We're not going to always get this right. We're not going to always get our deployments correctly. So how do we control the blast radius? How do we make sure we just don't blow everything up for everybody? So some of the early principles that we put in place were things like we need to deploy the same way into all the different environments. So no more partial automation. We need to make sure the quality signals that we're trying to follow, all those green tests, we do it the same way every time. We needed our deployments to take 0 downtime, and we wanted the deployments to happen during working hours. So right now, we deploy Azure DevOps using Azure DevOps, and we start at 8 a.m. on Monday morning, and if everything goes right, by 5 p.m. on Friday, we've deployed Azure DevOps. It doesn't always happen that way, but that's the goal. And no partial automation. These were all our early principles. One of the other aspects of DevOps that we bought into to do this, though, to do our branching model the way we wanted to, was this idea of feature flags. Because feature flags decouple deployment from exposure. I've got a lot of stuff up in Azure DevOps right now that you're not even aware of because it's hidden by a feature flag. But when I'm ready, I can turn it on and those features will be there for you. And then if something goes wrong or it's not working correctly, I can turn them back off. So feature flags are a great way to allow you to do that constant pulling and pushing from master, which you need to do to make sure you don't have really bad merges, and a way to also determine when you deploy or when you actually expose your code for people to use it. So feature flags are awesome. What could go wrong? Well, we were gonna launch Visual Studio Online in 2013, and right before the big launch event, we turned on everything. I turned on all the feature flags. We pushed all this code out there, all this stuff was hidden. We turned on all these feature flags. And we brought the system up and down for about a week. You may remember this graphic from earlier when I talked about Brian Harry giving us being open and honest about what happened. The issue was we had tested everything, but what we really hadn't tested was what happens when we flip all those flags on at the same time and the interactions. So nowadays, in the future, if you're going to speak at an event, any feature flags have to be thrown about 48 hours in advance. We also decided that we needed to do progressive exposure in how we're deploying. So we have multiple rings that we deploy to now. We go one stage at a time. The first ring is the canary ring. That's the Azure DevOps group itself. We dog food our product. Then we deploy to a data center that's got some users that have signed on to always stay on the latest and greatest. So they know it may or may not be stable. Then we deploy to a data center with a large number of users, so we can get a lot of people interacting with the update. We deploy to an overseas data center so we can test latency, and then we deploy out to everybody else. And as you can see, we're actually using Azure pipelines to deploy Azure pipelines. We use the current product to deploy the new version of the product. One of the other things we're starting to get into is this idea of chat ops. So we've actually built a bot called AsDD for Azure DevOps for Microsoft Teams, where we can go in and ask, where are things in the deployment? And AsDD can come back and say, oh, here's where the deployments are in the different rings. Here's where you might be having an issue in a particular ring. And then you can actually have it drive you into the Azure pipeline to where the actual issue is so you can start seeing what's happening. So this is a new thing that we're just, are starting to try to get into, but we're finding that things like this are very helpful because we're, again, bringing information to where our team members are living. Now, your Azure DevOps journey is going to follow what we call the J-curve, okay? J-curve starts over here on the left, and you begin a transformation, you identify some quick wins. A lot of time those quick wins are things like automation, like putting some pipelines in place. And you're thinking, this is great, DevOps is awesome. And then you enter what I call the valley of sorrow, because that's where it gets hard. That's where you've got your quick wins that you could get with tooling, but now you're having to change your people and you're having to change your process. And that's where a lot of people give up. And that's where I've got to encourage you, don't give up. The valley of sorrow is hard. That's where you're changing the culture that you live in. But you reach a point where you push through that, and then you hit the top of that J-curve, and suddenly it clicks, and it's like everything just seems to be working. You're deploying faster. You're deploying higher quality code. So I have to encourage people when you're doing this to make sure that you're going to be excited initially, and then it's going to get hard, and you got to stick through the hard part to where you come out the other side even better. So moving into 2020, we have a lot of different things. We're trying to do a little more inner sourcing. We're trying to shift even farther left with security and compliance. We're searching some better ways to do resilience or chaos engineering. Still trying to, these are all some of our plans at the beginning of the year. Now your DevOps journey in general is going to have its ups and downs, that whole J-curve, but it's worth it at the end. And I got one more slide to show you exactly why it's worth it at the end. And that's this one right here. Features delivered per year by the Azure DevOps team. So our transformation over the years has allowed us to deliver more and more value to customers at a faster and faster velocity each time. So you could see back in 2012, we delivered 22 features. And then you could see we were steadily moving up, hockey stick curving, to where in 2017, we delivered 364 features. Well, in 2018, it kind of dropped off. And you may be wondering why it dropped off. Well, it dropped off because of GDPR. We had to stop and do a whole bunch of work to make sure we're GDPR compliant. And we also started re-architecting on some of Azure DevOps at that point. Because right now, when we deploy Azure DevOps, we deploy everything. So we started re-architecting things into individual services so that we could just deploy Azure boards, or we could just deploy Azure pipelines. And that's it. That's what I've got for you. So I really appreciate your time. I've got 3 minutes, so I'll see if there's any questions that people have. If you have them, go to conference room 3 in Slack. Otherwise, at 7:40, we'll drop off of this, but I'll keep answering questions in Slack for a little bit if you have any questions. You're welcome to reach out to me, hit me up on Twitter, shoot me an email. Happy to try to answer any questions you might have around DevOps. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. So let's see what we got. So can you give an update about the future of the on-prem version of Azure DevOps Server? So it's alive and kicking. So we release to Azure DevOps Service, the cloud version, every 3 weeks. Every 3 months, we take all the updates that we made every 3 weeks and we roll those into one update for the on-prem version. So the self-hosted version of Azure DevOps, so Azure DevOps Server, is usually always about 3 weeks behind or 3 months behind what we've got up in the cloud. So will Azure DevOps merge with GitHub Actions at some point? So Azure DevOps and GitHub are two distinct products. Obviously, GitHub is a premier destination for developers, especially for developers doing open source, but just for developers in general. And sorry, you heard my dog in the background. And Azure DevOps is still alive and strong and doing what it's doing as well. So I'm not aware of anything where they're going to merge at any point in time in the future. So there's a question. Thanks, Mickey, for the enlightened talk. who line manages your developers? If they can change teams like that, do their managers change each time? So if they do change from one feature team to the other, their managers could change, yes. So based off of whether they stayed on that feature team or on a feature team that was in that particular area, or whether they moved to a new area. So it depends. That usually there's team leads on the development team, but yes, it could change every time. Hush, it's okay. Um, do we have cases where there's a difference in opinion about what should be prioritized when it comes to feature functionality between teams and management? And if so, how do you handle this? That's a very good question. I'm sure there are cases where where what should be prioritized varies depending on who you are. Excuse me one second. Everyone meet Ollie. He's being a pain. So as far as how they handle it, I know that the teams are told from a broad perspective, this is what they need to work on. These are the long range priorities. They can then determine, they can then determine the specific priorities they're trying to do for that sprint, and they have to make a case for it. And if they can make the case for it, that's great. If they can't make the case for it, then I'm sure there's some changes that are made there. I'll be honest, I'm not sure the details of exactly how it's done, but I'll tell you what, I will find out, and if you'll give me some shoot me some contact information, I will be happy to send you some details on those questions. This would be great, but the last feature update, the on-prem version, is a long time ago. Okay, fair enough. Let me go find out where things stand for you on the current feature update for the on-prem version, and I will provide you some feedback on that. Again, if you want to send me an email, then and give me a chance to go ask the feature team about where things stand with the latest update, I will let you know. We've been pretty consistent about getting the updates out there every 3 months. I know sometimes we did not do that, but let me see what I can find out for you. All right, I know I punted on a couple of your questions because I wasn't quite sure what the answers were. If, again, give me a chance to find you some answers, shoot me an email with some contact information, and I'll be happy to find those for you. For everyone else, you're welcome to shoot me questions in the future. I'm going to put Ollie outside, and then I'll come back and answer questions in Slack. Thank you all very much.